Part 1. The Descent. Have you ever seen a swamp breathe? I have. And now I know that it doesn't just breathe, it hungers. My name is Mike Collins. I'm a wildlife photographer specializing in rare bird species. That's what brought me to Florida that day. The chance to photograph the elusive Everglades snail kite during its mating season. I never imagined that instead of capturing life through my lens, I'd be fighting to keep my own. The flight from Atlanta to Miami was supposed to be routine. Just 90 minutes in the air, then I'd rent a Jeep and head into the Everglades National Park. I remember checking my equipment one last time as we boarded. My Canon EOS R5, 3 different lenses, waterproof cases. Everything a nature photographer needs when heading into one of America's most unique ecosystems. I settled into seat 14A, window side. To my right sat an elderly man who introduced himself as Dr. Walter Fleming, a retired biologist who'd spent decades studying the Everglades ecosystem. Behind us was a college student named Tyler, headphones on, nodding to music only he could hear. Across the aisle, a middle-aged couple, the Harises, were celebrating their 20th anniversary with an airboat tour of the swamps. And then there was Karen, the flight attendant with a kind smile, who asked if I wanted coffee or orange juice. "Just water, please," I said. "I'll need to stay hydrated for the hike ahead." Little did I know how ironic those words would become. We were about 20 minutes from landing when the plane lurched violently to the right. My water spilled across my lap as oxygen masks dropped from above. The captain's voice, usually so steady, trembled as he ordered us to brace for impact. I don't remember much about the crash itself, just fragments. The deafening sound of metal tearing, screams morphing into prayers, the sensation of being thrown forward against my seatbelt, and then darkness. I came to with a splitting headache and the taste of blood in my mouth. The cabin was tilted at an angle, sunlight streaming through a massive tear in the fuselage. Smoke hung in the air, but not the thick black kind that signals an imminent explosion. Small mercies, I suppose. "Anyone hurt?" I called out, unbuckling my seatbelt and standing carefully on what used to be the wall of the aircraft. Dr. Fleming was conscious, a gash above his left eyebrow, bleeding steadily. "I'll live," he muttered, pressing a handkerchief to the wound. The Harises were helping each other out of their twisted seats. Mrs. Harris, Linda, I'd learn later, had what looked like a broken wrist. Her husband Dave had fared better, just some cuts and bruises. Tyler, the college kid, was shaking but unhurt. His headphones had somehow stayed on throughout the crash. Karen, the flight attendant, was already in professional mode, checking on the pilot and co-pilot. She returned shaking her head. "They didn't make it," she said softly. We were the only survivors, 6 strangers united by disaster. Outside the wreckage, the reality of our situation became clear. We'd crashed in what appeared to be the deepest part of the Everglades. Water and sawgrass stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional cypress tree or floating island. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the air was thick with humidity and the buzzing of insects. "Does anyone have cell service?" Linda asked, her voice tight with pain. We all checked our phones. No signal. Not even a single bar. "The plane must have gone down miles off course," Dr. Fleming said, surveying the landscape with a practiced eye. "We're in the deep glades now. No roads, no trails." "What about the emergency locator transmitter?" I asked Karen. "Won't that bring rescuers?" She nodded. It should have activated automatically during the crash. But she hesitated. We're in one of the most remote areas of the Everglades. It could take days for them to find us. Days. The word hung in the air like the mosquitoes now swarming around us. We salvaged what we could from the wreckage: water bottles, some snacks from the beverage cart, a first aid kit. I was grateful that my camera equipment had survived, secured in its waterproof case. It might not help us survive, but documenting our ordeal felt important somehow. As the sun began to set, we made a makeshift camp on a small hammock, a raised area of dry land, near the crash site. Using seat cushions and emergency blankets, we created what shelter we could. No one wanted to stray far from the wreckage, our only link to civilization. Night in the Everglades is a different world. The chorus of frogs and insects rose to a deafening crescendo, then would suddenly stop. Complete silence for a few heartbeats before resuming again. Alligator eyes glinted in the darkness, reflecting the light from our small emergency flashlight. They won't bother us if we don't bother them, Dr. Fleming assured us, though I noticed he kept scanning the water's edge nervously. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a sound that didn't belong among the natural symphony of the swamp. A soft, rhythmic swishing, like something large moving through the water, circling our little island. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Dr. Fleming, who was taking first watch. He nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. "Might be a large gator, but I've been around alligators before. They move with purpose, not this lazy, circular pattern. And they certainly don't make that other sound, the one that raised the hair on the back of my neck. A sound like whispering, almost words but not quite, emanating from the darkness just beyond our little circle of light. "Wake me for the next watch," I told Dr. Fleming, trying to keep my voice steady. I lay down but didn't sleep, my ears straining to catch that whisper again, to make sense of it. It was Karen who woke us all with her scream. Dawn was just breaking, painting the swamp in an ethereal light that made everything look slightly unreal. "What is it?" Dave Harris was on his feet instantly. Karen stood at the edge of our hammock, pointing at the water. Someone was calling my name. I heard it clearly, a voice from the water. We all looked where she was pointing. Nothing but still, dark water and morning mist. "You were dreaming," Linda said gently. "We're all on edge." Karen shook her head vehemently. "No, it was so clear. It sounded like my mother. But that's impossible. My mother's been dead for 5 years." A cold weight settled in my stomach. I didn't tell her about the whispers I'd heard in the night. We tried to settle back down, to conserve our energy for what we knew would be a difficult day ahead. But Karen remained agitated, pacing the small, dry area. "I'm just going to check something," she said suddenly, moving toward the water's edge. "Karen, wait," I started to say, but she was already stepping into the shallow water, heading toward a cluster of cypress trees about 30 feet away. "I saw something there," she called back. "Something shiny, maybe a boat, or..." She never finished her sentence. One moment she was there, wading through water that couldn't have been more than knee-deep. The next moment, nothing. No splash, no scream. Just the silent swamp and empty water where Karen had been standing. And as the sun rose fully over the Everglades, illuminating the vast wilderness that held us captive, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the water had been watching us all night. Waiting, breathing. The swamp had taken its first. Hey there, folks. Thanks so much for watching this story on the Dark Tales Vault channel. If those swamp whispers sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Every subscription helps me reach my first 100 subscribers milestone, which would mean the world to me. Stay tuned for the next part of Whispers of the Everglades coming soon. Remember, in the darkness, something always listens, and your support keeps these tales flowing. Part 2, The Hunt. Karen, Tyler's voice echoed across the water, breaking the stunned silence that had fallen over us. Karen. We spread out along the edge of our small island, calling her name, scanning the murky water for any sign of movement. Nothing disturbed the surface except our own desperate splashing as Dave and I waded in up to our waists, searching. She couldn't have just disappeared, Linda said, her uninjured hand pressed against her mouth. There has to be a sinkhole or an underwater cave or something. Dr. Fleming shook his head. I've studied these wetlands for 30 years. The geology here doesn't support that kind of formation. Then what happened to her? I demanded, frustration and fear making my voice sharp. The biologist's eyes met mine, and something in his gaze made my skin crawl. I don't know, he said quietly, and that's what worries me. We searched for hours, until the midday sun beat down so mercilessly that we had to retreat to the shade of the plain wreckage. Our water supply was limited, maybe 2 days' worth if we rationed carefully. We couldn't afford to become dehydrated. We need to make a decision. Dave said finally, wiping sweat from his forehead. Either we stay here and wait for rescue, or we try to find our way out. Stay, Linda argued immediately. The emergency beacon could be damaged, Tyler interrupted. And even if it's working, we're way off the flight path. Who knows how long before they expand their search this far? The kid's right, Dr. Fleming said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. This time of year, the water levels are rising daily. This hammock could be submerged in another day or two. A heavy silence fell over us as the reality of our situation sank in. I took out my camera and snapped a picture of our small group. 4 survivors clustered in the shadow of disaster. Something about preserving this moment felt important. Through my viewfinder, I noticed something I'd missed before. Behind Tyler, at the water's edge, strange markings disturbed the mud. Not footprints exactly, but long, sinuous grooves, as if something had been dragged from the water onto land and back again. I lowered my camera slowly. "We need to move," I said, not taking my eyes off those markings. "Now." We spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Dr. Fleming used his knowledge of the Everglades to determine our best route. According to his calculations, heading southeast would eventually bring us to a ranger station. About 20 miles of difficult terrain, but our best chance. "We need to stick to the tree islands when possible," he explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt. "Move during daylight, find high ground before dusk." I divided my camera equipment among the group. The waterproof cases could protect our meager supplies. Dave fashioned walking sticks from broken plane parts. Linda, despite her injury, packed the first aid kit and what remained of our food. As the sun began its descent, we took one last look at the crash site, our last connection to the world we knew, and stepped into the water. The Everglades are beautiful in a primal, untamed way. In different circumstances, I would have been captivated by the interplay of light through the cypress trees, the startling blue of a heron taking flight, the perfect stillness of water reflecting sky. Instead, each shadow concealed potential threats. Each ripple sparked adrenaline. We made good progress that first afternoon, reaching a sizable tree island by sunset. As we set up camp, Tyler pointed out a group of alligators in the distance. At least a dozen of them clustered together on a mud bank. "That's unusual behavior," Dr. Fleming remarked, frowning. "They're typically solitary creatures unless it's mating season, which it isn't. Maybe they're hunting as a pack," Linda suggested. The biologist shook his head. "Alligators don't hunt in packs. It's almost as if they're seeking safety in numbers." That night, huddled together on our small patch of dry land, Dr. Fleming told us a story I wish I'd never heard. The Seminole tribes that lived in these wetlands had many legends, he began, his voice low. They believed the Everglades were home to spirits both benevolent and malicious. One such entity they called the Oki-Sani, the hungry water. According to their stories, it was neither ghost nor creature, but something in between, a consciousness that lived within the swamp itself, capable of manipulating water, creating illusions, even mimicking voices of loved ones to lure its prey. The tribes claimed it fed not on flesh, but on the final breath of the drowning, what they considered the essence of life itself. "That's just a legend, right?" Tyler asked, his earlier bravado noticeably diminished. Dr. Fleming poked at our small fire. "Of course, but like many indigenous legends, it likely served as a warning about very real dangers. Disorientation in the swamps, hallucinations from toxic plants, the risks of venturing too far from safe paths." I didn't say what I was thinking, that Karen had followed a voice only she could hear, a voice she'd said sounded like her dead mother. That night, I took the first watch. As the others slept, I stared out at the water surrounding our island. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the patterns of ripples around us. The normal sounds of the swamp, frogs, insects, the occasional splash of a hunting predator, created a constant backdrop of white noise. Until they didn't. The silence was so sudden it felt like pressure against my eardrums. One moment, the cacophony of night creatures. The next, nothing. as if the entire swamp was holding its breath. Then I saw it, a ripple moving against the current, a deliberate disturbance in the water heading toward our island. I reached for my flashlight, hands trembling slightly, and directed the beam toward the movement. Nothing there, just still black water. But the ripple continued, a paradox of motion without cause, circling our small haven. And with it came the whispers, the same I'd heard the night before, but clearer now. Not quite words, but almost. A cadence that mimicked speech while remaining frustratingly unintelligible. I wanted to wake the others, but something kept me rooted in place, straining to understand what I was hearing. The whispers grew louder, seeming to come from all directions at once, yet still maddeningly indistinct. Then, abruptly, one voice separated from the others, a woman's voice, familiar after our brief acquaintance. "Mike," Karen's voice called softly from the darkness. "Mike, help me. I'm lost." I jerked to my feet, heart pounding. "Karen," I called, sweeping the flashlight across the water. For just an instant, I thought I saw her, a pale face just breaking the surface about 20 yards away. Then it was gone, leaving only expanding ripples. "What's happening?" Tyler was awake now, scrambling to his feet beside me. "I thought I saw." I began, but stopped as my flashlight beam caught something else. A set of wet footprints leading from the water's edge up onto our island. Fresh prints, water still pooling in them, leading directly to where Dr. Fleming lay sleeping. I swung the light to the biologist. He was perfectly dry, seemingly fast asleep. But as the beam crossed his face, his eyes snapped open, reflecting the light with the same golden-green shine as an alligator's. He blinked, and it was gone. Just an ordinary man squinting against the sudden brightness. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting up. I lowered the light, my mind racing. "Nothing, elite. Thought I heard something." As the others settled back down, I stared at those footprints until the water in them evaporated into the humid night air. By morning, there was no trace they had ever existed. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew that whatever lurked in these waters, legend, predator, or something beyond understanding, it wasn't just following us anymore. It was among us. Part 3, The Revelation. Morning broke with an unsettling fog hovering over the water, transforming the landscape into something dreamlike and unfamiliar. None of us had slept well. The others didn't know what I'd seen in the night, but they'd felt it, a presence watching, waiting. "We need to keep moving," I said, avoiding Dr. Fleming's eyes as I packed my gear. We waded through chest-deep water for hours, following Dr. Fleming's lead. I kept him in front of me, unwilling to let him out of my sight. Whatever I'd witnessed last night had planted a seed of distrust I couldn't shake. Yet he moved with confidence through the labyrinth of sawgrass and cypress, his knowledge of the terrain undeniably valuable. Around midday, Tyler spotted something floating in the water ahead. "Is that?" He didn't finish the question, already splashing forward. It was Karen's uniform jacket, snagged on a partially submerged branch. Dave retrieved it carefully, checking the pockets. Inside, we found her ID badge, a small notebook, and a plastic whistle. "She must have come this way," Linda said, hope brightening her exhausted face. I wasn't so sure. The jacket was perfectly placed, like bait in a trap. And something about the way Dr. Fleming examined it, his expression unreadable, sent a chill through me despite the sweltering heat. We pressed on, spirits paradoxically lifted by this grim discovery. If we'd found trace of Karen, perhaps we were on the right path after all. The landscape gradually changed as we traveled southeast. The water became shallower, the tree islands more frequent. By late afternoon, we'd reached what Dr. Fleming called a strand, a slightly elevated strip of land where cypress trees grew in abundance, creating a natural pathway. "We're making good progress," he announced, consulting the crude map he'd sketched. "If we maintain this pace, we should reach the ranger station by tomorrow evening." Relief washed over our small group. The prospect of rescue, of returning to the normal world, suddenly seemed possible again. We decided to make camp early, taking advantage of the relatively dry ground. Tyler and Dave gathered firewood while Linda sorted through our dwindling supplies. I took the opportunity to check my camera equipment, secretly hoping to find evidence of what I'd seen last night on my memory cards. Scrolling through the photos, I stopped at one I'd taken of our group at the crash site. There was nothing unusual at first glance, just 4 frightened people huddled together. But when I zoomed in on the background, my blood ran cold. Just beyond the water's edge, partially obscured by reeds, a face stared back at the camera. Not human, not quite. The proportions were wrong, the eyes too large and widely spaced, the mouth impossibly wide. It might have been a trick of light and shadow, but combined with everything else we'd experienced. I looked up to find Dr. Fleming watching me intently. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. "Just checking the battery life," I lied, switching off the camera. As dusk approached, we built a fire larger than was strictly necessary, all of us seeking comfort in its light. Dr. Fleming regaled us with more stories of the Everglades, its formation, its ecosystem, its legends. His knowledge was impressive, but I noticed something odd. He spoke of the swamp with an intimacy that went beyond academic understanding, almost like reverence. We were settling in for the night when Tyler suddenly shot to his feet. "Did you hear that?" he asked, staring into the darkness beyond our fire. "Someone's calling my name." "Tyler, don't." I started, but he was already moving, drawn toward the water like a sleepwalker. Dave caught him by the arm. "There's nothing out there, kid." "But I heard it," Tyler insisted, eyes wide and unfocused. "My brother, it's Josh's voice." "Your brother?" Linda asked. "He drowned when I was 10, Tyler said, still straining against Dave's grip. "But I heard him. He's out there. He needs help." Dr. Fleming approached slowly. "The swamp plays tricks on the mind," he said softly. "Exhaustion, dehydration, fear. They can make us hear what we most want to hear, or most fear hearing." Tyler blinked rapidly, seeming to come back to himself. "You're right," he muttered, sinking back down by the fire. "Just tired, I guess." But that night, as the others slept, I watched Tyler toss and turn, murmuring responses to voices only he could hear. And I noticed Dr. Fleming watching him too, with an expression that wasn't concern but something closer to anticipation. I must have drifted off eventually, because I jolted awake to Linda's scream. Dawn was just breaking. Tyler was gone. "He was right here," Dave said, pointing to the empty space where the young man had been sleeping. "I checked on him not 2 hours ago." We found his footprints leading to the water, a single line of impressions that stopped abruptly at the edge. No signs of struggle, no disturbance in the mud. Just like Karen, he'd vanished. Something broke inside me then, the dam of rationality I'd been clinging to. "It's taking us one by one," I said, my voice strange to my own ears. "The hungry water, the oaky whatever. It's real." "Mike, you need to calm down," Dave said, exchanging concerned glances with Linda. "No, you need to wake up," I shouted, rounding on Dr. Fleming. "You knew, didn't you? That's why you've been leading us deeper into the swamp instead of out." The biologist regarded me calmly. "I've been guiding us toward the ranger station exactly as I said I would." "Bullshit. The same night you told us about the hungry water legend, I saw footprints leading from the water to where you were sleeping. I saw your eyes reflect light like an alligator's." Dave stepped between us. "Mike, you're not thinking clearly." "Then explain the photo," I demanded, turning on my camera and zooming in on the face in the reeds. "Explain this." They gathered around the small screen. Linda gasped. Dave swore softly. Dr. Fleming said nothing, his expression unreadable. "We need to get out of here now," Linda whispered. "Forget the ranger station. Just find the nearest road, the nearest people." We packed in frantic silence. The fragile hope of yesterday shattered. I kept my distance from Dr. Fleming, who made no attempt to defend himself against my accusations. As we prepared to leave, I found Tyler's backpack where he'd left it. Inside was a small leather journal I hadn't seen before. I flipped it open, recognizing Tyler's handwriting on the first page, dated 3 days before our flight. finally heading to Florida to investigate the Everglades disappearances. Professor Whitman thinks it's all just accidents and poor cell reception, but the pattern is too consistent. 23 people in the last decade, all vanishing near what locals call the breathing marsh. Whatever's happening there, I'm going to document it. My hands trembled as I turned to the next page. It held a newspaper clipping about a wildlife biologist who'd gone missing in the Everglades 5 years ago. The accompanying photo showed a man who was definitely not our Dr. Fleming. When I looked up, Fleming was standing directly in front of me, his expression no longer human. "The curious ones always taste the sweetest," he said, his voice overlapping with other voices, Karen's, Tyler's, and others I didn't recognize. Their final breaths are filled with such delicious revelation. I scrambled backward as his form seemed to ripple, like a reflection in disturbed water. Dave and Linda were already running, disappearing into the cypress strand. I followed, terror giving me speed I didn't know I possessed. Behind us, something large displaced water. Not the splash of someone running, but the surge of something rising from depths that shouldn't exist in a swamp. The strand ended abruptly at a vast open marsh. Dave and Linda were ahead of me, wading through knee-deep water toward another tree island about 100 yards away. "Hurry!" Dave shouted back to me. "We can make it!" I was halfway across when I heard Linda scream. Dave was being pulled under, the water around him churning violently. He reached toward her, his face a mask of terror, before disappearing completely. Linda stood frozen, shock rendering her immobile. I grabbed her arm as I reached her, dragging her toward the island. "Don't stop," I yelled. "Whatever happens, don't stop running." We were nearly there when Linda stumbled, crying out in pain. Her injured wrist had given way. As she fell, the water around her feet began to swirl, forming a small whirlpool that grew rapidly in size and strength. "Linda!" I reached for her hand, our fingers brushing before the current pulled her away. Her eyes met mine in one final moment of perfect understanding before the swamp claimed her too. I threw myself onto the island, crawling as far from the water as possible. My camera, somehow still clutched in my hand, recorded one final image. The surface of the marsh stretching to the horizon, beautiful and serene, as if nothing had happened. I don't remember much after that. Rangers found me 3 days later, dehydrated and delirious, babbling about voices in the water. They told me the plane had crashed more than 30 miles from where I was found, an impossible distance to have traveled on foot through the Everglades. They found no trace of the other survivors. The official report listed Karen, Tyler, Dr. Fleming, and the Harises as missing, presumed deceased. The wreckage of our plane was recovered, along with the bodies of the pilot and co-pilot, but the swamp kept its other secrets. I've shown the Rangers my photos, told them about Tyler's journal, tried to make them understand what hunts in those waters. They attribute my story to trauma and exposure. Perhaps they're right. But some nights, I wake to the sound of whispering outside my window, voices calling my name with familiar cadences. And on those nights, I could swear the tap water in my bathroom sink tastes brackish, like swamp water, and moves against the laws of gravity, circling the drain in patterns that almost form a face. I don't know if the hungry water is confined to the Everglades, or if it can follow those it has marked. I don't know if I truly escaped, or if it simply allowed me to carry its story out into the world, like bait to attract more curious souls. All I know is that every year, hundreds of people vanish in the American wilderness without a trace. And sometimes when water is perfectly still, it almost seems to breathe. Hey there, folks. Thanks so much for watching the final part of this story on the Dark Tales Vault channel. If these swamp whispers have you checking your faucets tonight, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Every subscription helps me reach my first 100 subscribers milestone, which would mean the world to me. Got your own creepy experiences with water or the wilderness? Share them in the comments below. Remember, in the darkness, something always listens, and your support keeps these tales flowing.